Greetings, our listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited about today's guest. Been wanting to talk about the topic and been wanting to have this guest on for a while. The topic is basically Jimmy Lai and Hong Kong and the future of China and what the hell's going on a whole bunch of other fronts. And the guest is Mark Clifford, who is the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. He's a PhD historian from the University of Hong Kong. He also has many awards and fancy degrees and stuff like that, and has been a journalist for a very long time. He was the editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, and the editor-in-chief of the Standard, not the Weekly Standard of blessed memory, but the Hong Kong The Standard, and all of that kind of stuff. Mark Clifford, welcome to the Remnant.
Hey, Jonah, thanks a lot. Great to be here at last, and worth the wait.
Okay, so I committed the greatest of faux pas for a book author hosting a podcast about a book, because I didn't actually mention the book yet. You are the author of The Troublemaker, How Jimmy Lai Became a Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Dissident, and China's Most Feared Critic, the paperback of which will be released on December 2nd. So got that out of the way. And as I warned you, and as listeners expect, I should ask you, what is your book about?
Yeah, it's about one of the most extraordinary people I've been privileged to meet in my life, a guy named Jimmy Lai. He was a product of the Maoist revolution, escaped famine in China, probably would have starved to death, escaped at the age of 12, arrived penniless in Hong Kong, slept on factory floors. 15 years later, he owned a factory, went on to become the biggest sweater maker in Hong Kong, father of fast fashion retailing. All that would be a great Hong Kong success story. But what makes him really interesting is what happened after the 1989 Tiananmen killings, when China killed hundreds, maybe thousands of its own people, just mowed them down with tanks and guns. And Jimmy said, wait a minute, I'm not just doing fast fashion anymore. I'm doing fast media, I'm doing democracy, and started first. So here's a guy who knew nothing about media, came out of the rag trade, literally off the factory floor in Hong Kong, set up first a magazine, then a newspaper, right before the Chinese took over Hong Kong from the British in 1997. Went on to set up within 10, 15 years, had the largest, most influential Chinese language media operation in the world, with big operations in Taiwan as well as Hong Kong. De facto, although he's not a political guy, like he's not a Mandela or a Lech Walesa, became the de facto leader of the opposition in Hong Kong as Hong Kongers fought for the freedom that China had promised them, but wasn't willing to grant, and ended up 5 years ago next month being put in jail. So he's been in jail for about 1,800 days. That 1,800 day anniversary will be 2 days after my paperback launches, sadly, coincidentally. Most of that time in solitary confinement, facing an array of just made-up kangaroo court charges, the most serious of which are national security law charges that we're still waiting for a verdict 5 years after the initial arrest. But that will almost certainly be a guilty verdict. And he will. He's in his late 70s. He'll get a sentence that will put him away for life. So, in my day job as president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, I and others are working to get Jimmy released. I was on the board of directors at the media company. I've got 6 other colleagues. We've got 7 colleagues in jail who are being held unjustly, and they're just, say, 1% or so of the 700 or so political prisoners in Hong Kong. So Jimmy Lai is an amazing guy. I've known him for more than 3 decades, but he's emblematic of this struggle for freedom in Hong Kong, and the attempt to salvage what we can of a once, at least, of people's freedoms in a once great city that the Chinese communists have willfully destroyed.
So we'll circle back to. Can I call him Jimmy? I think everyone I know who knows
Everyone
about
calls
this,
him
everyone
Jimmy.
calls it Jimmy. So and it feels weird to call him Lai. But in terms of Hong Kong, I'm sure all the listeners know Hong Kong reverted back to Chinese ownership or sovereignty or control after what, a 99-year lease or something like that to the
Yeah,
British.
it was in all 156. All these complicated treaties, but
Yeah.
one treaty ran out. So after 156 years of Hong Kong Island being under British control and some of the larger surrounding areas for 99 years, July 1st, 1997, it all went back to China.
So there were some of us. I mean, I was like most of us much younger back then, but there was a lot of talk back then about how Hong Kong would kind of be a reverse poison pill kind of thing, and it would hasten China's turn towards capitalism. Um, and the bacillus of freedom and liberty would spread and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't feel like that has happened. But so when you look at just sort of it's a ground truth kind of factual question. Does Hong Kong feel at all like a free city anymore? Does it feel, are there still things you can get away with in Hong Kong that maybe you couldn't on the mainland, or is it all just a fiction and it's just under Chinese control in the same way? Because there was a lot of talk about how it would be two systems, and that's all failed, right? So is it really just one system now, or is there still something qualitatively different about being in Hong Kong?
Well, first of all, I should say I left 5 years ago. I'd probably be arrested if I went back. So this is secondhand. But
Sure.
I'd say, in its essence, for Hong Kong Chinese, it's more or less like any mainland city. If you're a Western expat, it's still nicer. There's more room. The restaurants are better. The quality of life is better. There are some things that superficially are different. For example, there's open court. Jimmy is just finished a 155-day trial has just wrapped up. AFP and Reuters were there every day covering it. If it were the mainland, it would be done and dusted in a half a day and nobody would be allowed in. Hong Kong has its own currency, it has its own tax system, its own administration. But increasingly, we're seeing mainland security people driving policy of anything that matters. And when I say anything, I mean the T-shirt that you're wearing, Jonah, your unwillingness to stand up and salute the flag at a national anthem. These are the kinds of things that people are being thrown in jail for now. So pretty similar to the mainland. But there's the mainland and there's the mainland. You look at the internment of Uyghurs, you look at the ongoing destruction of Tibetan culture. It's not that bad in Hong Kong, but it's run by the Chinese Communist Party, which did not like that idea of the reverse poison pill you were talking about, and took it really seriously, and I think was concerned that Hong Kong ideas of freedom, that people like Jimmy Lai, who were mainlanders, and let's remember, for every one of Hong Kong's 7.5 million people, well, every one of the Chinese people in Hong Kong came from the mainland, or their parents came from the mainland, or their grandparents came from the mainland, with like 3 or 4 exceptions. I mean, this is a colonial city of people who escaped the ravages of China, pre-communist China, and above all, post-communist China. Jimmy was one of 1.5 million people who came in that first decade or so after Mao. 3 million people risked their lives in many cases to come. So, they knew what they were fighting against, and they wanted freedom, and China doesn't want them to have freedom. And I think, we kind of forget, it wasn't just like China walked in one day. China had international treaties, or one specific treaty with Britain, lodged at the United Nations, promising that all of Hong Kong's existing freedoms, everything, right to trial by jury, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, go on, that would all be respected for 50 years, that we'd have this two systems that you alluded to, one country, two systems. They then doubled down and had a mini constitution, which promised even more. They promised Hong Kong people, you'll be masters in your own house, get rid of the colonial running dogs, you'll have full universal suffrage, as well as, thoroughgoing democracy. All of those were just lies. And so is it the same as mainland China? No. Parts of mainland China, it seems, are actually freer. I mean, it's I think day-to-day life in Shanghai is probably more open at this point than Hong Kong is. But it's kind of a distinction without a difference at this point. If you want to think freely, you're as bad off in Hong Kong as you are in Shanghai.
And so when you say they were all lies, were they lies from the beginning, or were they, did the elevation of Xi turn them into lies because he had a different policy.
Yeah. I think they were lies from the beginning, although I accept the fact that China kind of tried to keep its hands off Hong Kong for the first 10 years or so. But ultimately, I think that the history of the Chinese Communist Party is that it can't brook any kind of opposition, no matter how small. So here's an example. There was an amazing woman, Anson Chan. She was the first chief secretary, which is the number two job below the governor, and then after the takeover, the chief executive. She straddled the handover. First Chinese and first woman to have that position. She would have been a perfect person to run Hong Kong. I mean, she was not a Democrat; she's become one, but she was just a great colonial administrator, and she would have been a great colonial administrator for the Chinese overlords. But the fact that she had some independent ideas and wouldn't just be under Beijing's thumb, and that they pushed her out and they harassed her. I mean, she had to retire from politics because she was afraid of being jailed. The fact that they can't take even loyal opposition, and they couldn't even from 1997, makes me realize that we were deluding ourselves, and I, like many other people, were naive. Now, of course, it's gotten much, much, much worse under Xi Jinping, but I think that China, I should go back a little bit in history in 1980s, 1990s, in the run up to the handover and after, and China consistently got bad advice. It talked to the tycoons in Hong Kong to get a read on the pulse of the city. And the tycoons are totally out of touch with reality as I knew it. And of course, as the 7 million or so grassroots Hong Kongers knew it. And they didn't understand Hong Kong's people's aspirations for freedom, not democracy, just as much freedom. But yes, they did want the right to elect the city council and the
Right.
mayor, which is really all they were asking for initially. But I think China thought that given 10 years, that a combination of carrots and sticks, that they could win fair and free elections. And in fact, there was a pro-China political party which did great grassroots work, did a lot of constituent service, had probably a quarter to a third of support, but they couldn't really move beyond that. And so I think China didn't understand, and still doesn't understand, Hong Kong, and so in that sense, the die was cast from the beginning. But under Xi Jinping, it is, I mean, it's really verging on totalitarianism.
Yeah, because I always thought that, again, I'm not a student of this in nearly as granular detail as you, but I always got the impression that it was more of an evolution of sort of authoritarianism, in part because I just always assumed if you really had eyes on taking Taiwan, then really just putting your heel on the throat of Hong Kong incentivizes the Taiwanese not to take any of your assurances seriously, right? I mean, um, and the remarkable thing to me is, from everything I read about Taiwan, is the success that China is having in sort of flipping influence operations within Taiwan as if what's going on in Hong Kong doesn't matter. And
Yeah.
it really does feel like there are a bunch of people who just actually don't care about freedom all that much.
Yeah. And let me get to the Hong Kong issue, though. And I think when you see how Beijing treated Hong Kong, and this one country, two systems formula that I mentioned earlier actually was originally developed in the late 1970s by Deng Xiaoping to be applied to Taiwan. And then when negotiations with the British came up, they were like, oh, yeah, we've got this formula. Let's just pull this out of the closet and see if it'll fly. So yeah, the idea was, let's show how great, wonderful overlords we are in Hong Kong, and then Taiwan will just fall into our lap. Well, I think yeah, that makes sense, Jonah. But what I think we're seeing is that actually this helps us explode a myth that Henry Kissinger and others have popularized, that Chinese are uniquely patient, long-term strategic thinkers. Nothing could be further from the truth. Chinese officials are incredibly short-term. no U.S. CEO worried about quarterly earnings is more short-term than a Chinese official who's just trying to get through the next, evaluation period, trying to get the next promotion, trying to kick whatever problem there is down the road a little bit. And so I think that unfortunately the CCP just reverted to form. It doesn't know how to deal with dissent. It's not subtle. It's not supple. And it was an evolution. I don't think it was planned from the beginning. I don't think Jiang Zemin on July 1st said, okay, we got a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan to crack down on Hong Kong. I think they thought the Hong Kong people will use carrots and sticks. The Hong Kong people will eventually tremble and obey. They'll see what's good for them, and it will kind of naturally adjust itself. And the Hong Kong people actually have thrown up obstacles and roadblocks to that plan in a way that we've never seen in modern Chinese, certainly not in PRC, People's Revolution of China, CCP, People's Republic of China history since 1949. And I think the Hong Kong people just have a unique identity, which they forged under British colonialism and beyond. And it's an identity that includes freedom. It turns out they're willing to fight for it.
Yeah. So tell me more about that. I mean, I like that you made this distinction between freedom and democracy. I'm pro-democracy. Don't get me wrong, but I would much rather live in a liberal society that protected all of the important bits of the Bill of Rights that didn't have enough democracy than in a quote unquote democratic place that didn't respect those. Right. I mean, like you can live a good and decent, fulfilling life, taking care of your kid in your business and speaking your conscience and worshiping you please without necessarily having democracy. It turns out you need democracy to keep politicians from turning into illiberal autocrats, but there's nothing guaranteed better about democratic votes. So like how does the Hong Konger commitment to sort of to freedom and manifest itself as resistance at this point?
Yeah, well, let me back up and try to unpack that because again, I think it's kind of a two-part question. And sorry, I never got to the Taiwan part of
No,
your
that's fine.
last question.
Yeah, go wherever you want to go. Yeah,
but no, first of all, I think I would like to tease this out a little bit about the distinction between freedom and democracy because Chinese and pro-Beijing, pro-Chinese apologists will say, well, look, Hong Kong wasn't a democratic polity under the British colonial government, and the Brits only tried to bring in democracy in the last 5 years. That's true. And by the way, Hong Kong had a huge amount of structural racism. I mean, anti-Semitism, snobbery. I mean, a lot of bad things of the sort that one sees in colonies. But it was a place where, with probably the exception, obviously, of the Japanese invasions of the 1940s and around the 1967 Cultural Revolution, most people didn't have to worry about the midnight knock at the door. And that's huge. And it meant that they could go to any church that they wanted. Again, huge.
They could go to court and get a fair hearing, which is huge.
People pick that apart. Well, was there the same justice for Chinese as there was for British? Probably not originally, but as time went on, I think there was a real commitment to freedom, to civil liberties of the sort you were talking about, rule of law. And but no, there was not electoral democracy. And we can go into the reasons for that, but one of the reasons was that the CCP, starting with Premier Zhou Enlai in the 1950s, leaned on the Brits and threatened them repeatedly that they should not move towards democracy or Hong Kong or China reserved the right to take really severe measures. And at a time when much of Hong Kong's water came from the mainland, still does, and when the People's Liberation Army troops were right across the border and could have walked into Hong Kong at any moment, that kind of threat wasn't an idle threat. I don't think the Brits were really eager to push democracy, and certainly the Chinese and British business communities told them they shouldn't. But what that meant is that Hong Kong's democracy movement was suppressed in a way that the elites could tell China, look, Hong Kong people don't care about politics. They just want to make money. They're just refugees. Well, we had 500,000 people out in the streets in 1989 in Hong Kong supporting the pro-democracy Tiananmen protesters. And yet still I had business people when I moved there in 1992 tell me, oh, Hong Kongers don't care about democracy. One of the most prominent is a guy with an American passport, Ronnie Chan, who runs a huge property development company, very involved with the Asia Society. And Ronnie will go around telling, I mean, I know him very well. I mean, he's a smart guy, but I don't think that he has any understanding of Hong Kong people's aspirations. And sorry to single him out. I mean, he's just typical of so much of the elite in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong people felt that they had freedom. They had freedom of a sort that they didn't have in China. And then really because the Chinese, in their short-sightedness, snubbed British Prime Minister John Major on a September 1991 visit to Beijing. They treated him very badly, and he just said, enough of this. I've had enough of the apologists, the panda huggers, the people in my own foreign office who want to just think you have to cozy up to China. You can't like poke the panda, as it were. And it was a historical fluke of the 92 election, but a remarkable man named Chris Patten lost his seat in Bath, was named as the last governor. And Chris, came from a different tradition. He'd been in the rough, and he'd started actually his first job in politics was working as very, very young fellow for John Lindsay's New York mayoral campaign. So he understood retail politics. He got the rough and tumble. He also understood the aspirations for freedom. So he came in with very strong backing from Major, who was just like fed up with it, fed up with the way Thatcher and his had been treated by the Chinese during these negotiations. And he did give Chris a pretty blank check to try to push forward democracy. It was too little, too late, but it did help cement things. And so there was this freedom, and there was an emergent democracy, and there was a promise in China's basic law to move towards full universal suffrage. And Patten couldn't quite get there. He made a lot of progress. Chinese immediately tried to roll it back. But by then, Hong Kong people had a taste not only of freedom, but of democracy. And that set in motion these, what became a tragic turn of events over the next 25 years, where it's tragic in the classic Greek sense. Both had their character, and that led to their fate. And the Hong Kong people's character was one of freedom and an aspiration, a thirst for democracy and for the autonomy that they'd been promised. And on the Chinese side, well, you're a bunch of Leninist thugs who don't know how to deal with any sort of dissent other than crushing it.
So, do you want to get to Taiwan? Real quick?
I just would. You did mention it, and I would just say it is remarkable. First of all, I think it's remarkable that Taiwan has survived since 1949. I mean, we're coming up to 8 decades of rule. But what's more remarkable is that they've morphed from, what had been, it had been a Leninist policy. The party, the Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek, was also pretty nasty. And they evolved in, a parallel evolution to what I saw when I lived in South Korea, into this incredibly vibrant democracy that's also, a tech-leading economy, just an open, pluralistic society that also has managed to keep some of the best elements of Chinese culture. And I think Taiwan is an affront to the Chinese Communist Party, because it gives the lie to their contention, to the CCP's contention, that Chinese people aren't ready for democracy, that they can't handle it. And I think, I think Taiwan is wonderful. No place is perfect, but it is disconcerting, as you were suggesting, that the influence peddling operations in the campaign of, the carrots and the sticks, the fear and the intimidation that just is kind of unrelenting from China, has seemingly, I guess, pushed a lot of people to think that they really have no alternative but to come to some kind of accommodation of the mainland. I think that we, the rest of the world, should do everything we can to support the resistance and the aspiration on the part of the people of Taiwan to keep their freedom, because we know that once the mainland has influence, and whether the mainland flag is flying or not, if they have their people in there, with the freedom and the democracy and the vibrancy and just the incredible culture and country that we have in Taiwan is going to be under threat, if not gone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. I think we should defend Taiwan, but the one place where the so-called realists and isolationists and sovereignty, pick your labels about the different foreign policy schools that of widely varying degrees of sophistication. But the one point the smarter people will make that I find very hard to argue with is we can't want Taiwan to be free and independent more than Taiwan does. And that's why those influence operations, which we don't have to get into details, but like you read these things about China being effective in flipping politicians and business leaders in Taiwan into almost being a fifth column for mainland China, and and also just even the people who are for Taiwan independence, the fact that they're not spending enough on their own defense and all of these things, it makes it harder. Sort of, it's the Jerry Maguire thing: help me, help you. Right? They have to show that they have to show that they'd sort of be a Pacific Ukraine, that they'd go it alone if they had to, and go by as that phrase, it's attributed to Goethe, but it's by somebody else. Be bold, and great forces will come to your aid. Signaling that they're willing to be bold will help other great forces come to their aid, and I sometimes worry that they get worn down in all of the operations from China.
Yeah, I'm completely with you, and it's a dialectical kind of chicken and egg kind of process. If that people are out there, you'll be bolder. But if you're bolder, there'll be more people out there. I should just one anecdote from my book, which is kind of telling. Jimmy Lai was about to buy a TV station in Taiwan. He increasingly he thought that Taiwan would be a springboard to bring democracy to the mainland, but at the last minute, and I really mean, the last day, he had the press release was ready, the celebratory signing banquet was, they had the menu. On that last day, pressure was put on the seller, not from Beijing, not to sell the TV network station to Jimmy, and instead it went to a mainland friendly buyer. And so I think you see, stuff going on behind the scenes that makes it's hard, right? You have a TV station. The difference between Jimmy Lai and a pro-democracy TV station versus a pro-Beijing TV station, I mean, that alone is not going to tip the balance. But you multiply
it's a big delta,
those by 100 times or 1,000 times, and that stuff is going on every day. The fight, you go to Taiwan, they're having to scramble fighters, constantly to protect against Chinese incursions into their airspace. You see the kind of stuff going on between China attacking the Japanese prime minister. It's tough, and you're right, people do have to stand up. I guess, hopefully it doesn't come to this, and hopefully deterrence prevents a conflict, because China realizes that the potential costs are too high. And obviously we're playing for time, we're playing for change in China. And hope is not a strategy. We can't just hope for the best. We've got to work for the best and make it clear to China that there's going to be a very high cost that's being paid. So I'm happy to see that other neighbors, Japan, Philippines, are, I think, beginning to understand that they need to take a more robust attitude, that Uncle Sam and the Pacific Fleet aren't just going to sail in to save the day, and that they, as you say, need to spend more on their defense, which it's shocking. I have to say, I was shocked to see how little Taiwan has been spending in recent decades, and that's because they knew they could count on us. And I think the world's changing, and hopefully their checkbooks will be used more readily.
So earlier you had said that the Chinese Communist Party is not nearly as, you used the word somewhere in there, supple. And I focus on that because I've been arguing for a very long time that, the argument that bringing China into the World Trade Order, which a lot of people in the 1990s were in favor. I mean, I was a little policy gnome back then, so no one was listening to me, but I was generally with that consensus. And a lot of my friends on the Trumpier right, for want of a different term, just simply say, well, that was obviously a mistake. That hasn't worked. And I always say, so far, by which I mean, you're absolutely right. If you're just going to do a snapshot of or a retroactive look of how it's worked out, it looks like it was a mistake. And I know Chow En-lai didn't actually say about the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell, but like there is a sort of too soon to tell aspect to this because, and that brings me back to the word supple, totalitarian regimes are strong, but they're strong like marble, and marble's brittle. And part of the problem for Western observers is that you don't get a lot of visibility into where the cracks are until those cracks are really obvious and chunks start falling off. And a lot of China experts, I've heard this from a bunch of different China experts, that the variations of the phrasing of the thing you have to understand about China is that the Communist Party is almost as afraid of the people as the people are afraid of it. And so I'm just wondering, if you had to bet 25 years from now, do you think there's a straight line that the Chinese Communist Party is going to keep where it is? Is it going to be the dominant sole superpower like their plan is? How healthy do you think that regime actually is?
Well, the great thing about getting a PhD in history is that you can say you don't predict the future because you just study history. And I can't predict it, but I can say with a great deal of certainty it's not going to be a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a great struggle. It's a titanic struggle between freedom and repression. And I think the world is slowly starting to wake up to that. Maybe we're already in World War III. I don't know. But we're in for some very tough, very testing times. And I think your analogy of marble is really, really good. One of my first memories, I was born in 1957, and strangely, one of my earliest memories around the time I turned 4 was a picture in our local newspaper, Springfield, Massachusetts, of this grainy, kind of really scary picture of this wall going up and all this barbed wire, and that was the Berlin Wall. I lived in Berlin in 1980, 81. That was a really solid, that was more than marble. That thing was never
Mm-hmm.
coming down. Then I lived in Korea in the late 80s. Willy Brandt, who is the father of Ostpolitik, knew more about East-West German relations than any person on the planet. And in October 1989, he said, the wall's never coming down in my lifetime. I mean, I grew up. The wall was my life, right? As much as it can be for an American kid. And a month later, that wall was gone. And I don't want to predict, I'm not predicting that for China, but I do look at, I think your thing about the regime being, well, I'd say as afraid, maybe more afraid of its people than people are of them. You have a couple hundred people, maybe it's a few thousand, holding up blank pieces of paper, and all of a sudden Xi Jinping does a 180-degree turn in COVID policy. Was that because he was looking for an excuse and he realized that he'd been wrong? I don't know, but it looked to me like he quote unquote lost face. And people say, Chinese leaders can't lose face. Shouldn't he have just doubled down?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but it seems to me like they were afraid that, today it was a few hundred people and tomorrow it was a few thousand, and who knew what it was going to be next month, because there were a lot of really angry people. And I think you really saw, particularly the opposition, the protests in Shanghai. And Shanghai is kind of the center of it, of it all in terms of, a developed commercial center. And you started seeing solidarity really interesting, between a fire in the Xinjiang region that killed Uyghurs because people were locked into their buildings, and people at the other end, ethnically and monetarily, the scale in China, in Shanghai, upper middle class people saying that could be us. We're being locked in. We're all in a big prison. I think we'll look back, and the COVID will be like when those cracks, in retrospect, that those cracks started appearing in a big way. And look at it. Why are so many, if China's so great, why are so many people trying to sneak into the U.S. from China? Why are people risking their lives, their kids' lives, to come across the Darien Gap? I mean, not under this administration, but I mean, this is like, things aren't so good in China, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are voting with their feet. They're taking their lives, their kids' lives, and putting them at risk. And I think that totalitarian regimes, we've never seen one last this long. So it doesn't mean that it can't keep going on for a while, but we've never seen an indefinite totalitarian regime. Obviously, Xi Jinping is uniquely or unusually skilled at managing power and at managing the the tools, especially the technology tools, at his disposal. But I think ultimately freedom wins. I mean, people don't like it, right? They don't
Yeah.
like it. They're voting with their feet. They're holding up blank pieces of paper. They're going to jail. I mean, the risks that people take in China to, show even the smallest bit of resistance are extraordinary, and people keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like part of the problem is traditionally totalitarian regimes or things approaching totalitarian regimes, we're afraid of market economics because market economics is a form of freedom. And um, they've figured out better than I would have expected how to square that circle. And I think partly the technology part of it is that if you have the panopticon state going full time, you can let people make a profit off of making jeans or doodads, but like,
To a certain extent. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but what if you're Jack Ma at Alibaba and you make one pretty moderate speech, just asking regulators to be have a little more of a light touch? All of a sudden, you're basically under house arrest and your
yeah.
business is being curtailed. I mean, everybody's. I don't know. We'll see how far this goes too.
So, one of the things I'm kind of obsessed with, and I've written about it a few different times in a few different ways, which is one of the reasons I will not be visiting China anytime soon, is you know people don't focus enough on Hong Kong. People don't focus enough on the Uyghurs. People don't focus enough on Tibet. People talk about. I'm not saying that you can't criticize Israel, but if you're going to talk about settler colonialism, look what they're doing to Tibet. Look at what they're doing to the Uyghurs, right? And one of the things I find fascinating is the way in which certain categories of thinking vanish when you go far enough abroad. And so I first learned this expression from The Economist, so it's not my crack pottery, about Chinese Han supremacy. That the Han Chinese, basically, it's a Jim Crow country. And that if you're not Han Chinese, depending on what ethnic group you are, you have a sliding scale lower number of rights and liberties, access to best schools, internal passports, ability to travel, ability to get certain jobs, that kind of thing. And no one in the West really talks about it. And I'd be okay with not talking about it to a certain extent. Cultural diversity, different countries are different, and blah, 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 blah. But when we elevate at home issues of this sort of apartheid, as institutional racism, and then you don't care about it for this totalitarian regime, the double standard is really hard for me to get my head around. And I've never been to China. I've read a lot about these sorts of issues, but until you're actually in a place, it's very difficult to sort of appreciate. Do you think Han supremacy is an unfair, unjust phrase? Do you think it's an exaggeration? Is it a real thing? Is it, yes, on the books, it's sort of a real thing, but you have to understand there are nuances and exceptions on the ground. I mean, like, if I brought this up to you, like, where would you correct me if we were having dinner?
I think it understates the issue. Actually, I mean, I
Oh,
think it's
fantastic! Because I was trying to really be not the hothead here, because I could go much
no. I
harder
mean,
on
I think
this.
it's so real, and the hot. I mean, it's the Jim Crow analogy is interesting. Actually, it's more like apartheid though, because you can't. I mean, it's beyond Han though. It's very class oriented, which is ironic for a supposed Marxist state. But you can't. You literally keep the peasants down on the farm. You can't
Mm-hmm.
move into a city to better yourself very easily without getting all your papers changed, which means paying off some bureaucrat. You can't see, and if you do move into the city, you're there as an illegal worker, and you've got the potential of being thrown out at any time. Your kids can't go to school in the city. So there's a whole apartheid system that's kind of on top of, and I think exacerbates the Han Chinese thing. So you can be Han Chinese and be discriminated against. Definitely, if you're Uyghur, Tibetan, or one of the, I think it's
Mm-hmm.
80 odd other so-called ethnic minorities, you might be able to dress up in a nice costume for some tourist show, but you're not gonna get the same crack at things. It's really something. And I mean, to your point about how Americans, orientalize, I don't know if that's still the right word, but other China, it's kind of like there are a lot of people in the States who are like, oh, I don't like X in the whoever the president or politician or ruling party is in the States. I don't like them. Therefore, and China doesn't like, or they don't like China. Therefore, I like China. There's this kind of, without people thinking it through. And I would say this as a kind of recovering leftist who went to Berkeley as an undergrad. I think that the left is just completely blind, totally naive. I mean, much of the country is, but I mean, it's more pronounced. I think in the media, in academia, not everywhere. I mean, one of the people on my board at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation is Professor Perry Link, who's one of the most clear-eyed analysts in the world about the Chinese Communist Party. Places like The Guardian have done, and the New York Times, have done a lot on China, but still there's a real naivete about not understanding, the cruelty of this regime. I mean, let me just take one example of just gratuitous cruelty. I've a couple of Hong Kong Chinese colleagues. They both have bounties on their head. One of them got asylum in the U.S. First Hong Konger in recent times to get political asylum in the U.S. The other one moved to the U.K. when she was 14, 15 years old with her family. Both of them have $130,000 bounties on their head from the Hong Kong authorities simply for what they're doing in the U.S., in the U.K., free speech oriented. One of them still has parents back in Hong Kong. So the police pull her parents in, tell the press about it, subject her parents to this, ritual humiliation. They're not in jail yet. There's another person who's in a similar situation whose father's on trial simply because he tried to help his daughter out a little bit. I have something to do with signing a life insurance policy here or there. That's somehow a kind of terrorist money laundering offense. It's like you go after people's parents, you go after their kids. And the list of cruelties just it's unbelievable. It's unimaginable. You just can't even think about it. And yet we're being asked to say that China's second largest economy in the world is just kind of like a normal country. It can be on the UN Human Rights Commission. It's this whole, kind of model for development for the world. I mean, this is nonsense. This is not a world we want to live in.
So it's interesting to me. You said something about the COVID period. So I have, just for level setting, I'm a Reaganite conservative who finds it easier to talk to left of center people who care about like facts and reason and the American tradition and all these kinds of things than I do to a lot of people who've sort of become red-pilled nationalists on the right. It's a strange time, and but I've done a lot of work on why our politics got all screwed up, and if I had to do the two structural reasons for it, one was the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. There's a lot of good social science that says that those kinds of financial crises create long-tailed populist uprisings. I think historians are going to look back and see the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Parties as basically two sides of the same coin, right? And then the other thing was COVID, which, like, people don't appreciate the degree to which pandemics mess with people's heads in all sorts of lizard brain ways that are very difficult to talk about, that are very difficult to sort of put a finger on. And I think the back-to-back of those things, I can do chapter and verse about how it's made people weird, right? I can name specific people who kind of went nuts because of those two kind of factors. Given the way Xi clamped down on COVID in China, I have to assume that, and given the really strong possibility that there is a financial crash because of what's going on with real estate there, it feels to me that like the order is reversed, but there could be a real populist sort of powder keg explosion over there in the next 10 years. What do you think that would look like? Like, and on the COVID front, is there, I mean, I know you haven't been there in 5 years, but you talked to a lot of people from around there. Is there stuff below the surface, below behind the marble that would support that or detract from that theory that they got messed up by COVID too.
No, Jonah, really interesting analysis. I've just been talking with somebody about. I think you're absolutely right about COVID. I don't know why. I mean, I'm nobody. I don't really follow this stuff that closely, but it's obvious to me that COVID had huge impact on U.S. politics. The same thing with the financial crisis. I hadn't really kind of quite saw them as bookends in the same way, and I had not thought about the parallels to China. Obviously, COVID it broke the social contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're upper middle class, the idea, and by the way, the economy, we will never see an economy of this scale or remotely of this scale. They grew as China did for 10% a year for 3 decades or so. I mean, it's mathematically impossible almost. And, we could see that was going to slow down. It inevitably does. I mean, it's just arithmetic. And, it happened to be that Xi Jinping made it a lot worse by not continuing to reform and liberalize and open up the economy. That would have slowed down the slowdown.
Mm-hmm.
And getting back to your WTO question, like you, I was, really supported WTO. I wrote a book with the incoming Director General of the WTO, changing China, changing world trade. Some people thought that it was going to be the end of China. It was going to be too much of a shock. We thought that it was going to promote necessary reforms, and it did. It was a real jolt. They were in need of another reform. It's kind of 10 or so years later, and 15, and instead they got Xi Jinping. So you've already got these, I would say, deep structural problems. The incredible overinvestment in real estate and property and infrastructure of and really repressed consumer spending, repressed financial systems, so consumers don't get a return on their investment. And meanwhile, concrete's being poured. It's not really being used for anything.
Can you explain to people? I mean, I can do it a little bit. The way the system's set up, investing in equities is a problematic thing for normal people, and so really the way you save is through real estate arbitrage and investment. And so there's this oversupply. Lots of places that are not being occupied, which is bizarre for a country with that big a population. And the debt financing is all fakakta. But anyway, if you can just give a little more explanation to the listener.
Well, basically, for a variety of reasons, consumers don't spend. They have a very high propensity to save, and that's because there's not much of a social safety net, and medical care is pretty minimal unless you have cash. It's all about the cash now. So the equity market is prone to huge swings. So big run-ups. By the time your average Mr. or Mrs. Wong get in there, the thing's ready to collapse. They lose everything. They're scarred for 10 years. They come back in. The cycle repeats itself. So equities and governance is lousy. And so, although the Chinese economy has been growing very rapidly, the actual returns in the stock market are over a period of decades they're dwarfed by the U.S. We have stronger governance and we have a more robust capitalist economic framework. And so a lot of that money is the money is put into savings. Much of that goes into bank deposits, which, because of technical terms, financial repression, you keep interest rates, you keep returns for those savers to a very, very low level. You take what's basically free money, you pour it into your friends or whatever, you pour it into a steel company, you pour it into building a high-speed train, you pour it into bridges and roads. And yeah, there's been some great things, great train network, the roads have been built out, but it's kind of like enough is enough. You can only pour half the world's cement for, 20 years. You can't do it for, 200 years. And they seem to think they can just keep doing it. And they're reaching the end of any kind of economically rational spending on property and on infrastructure, and yet they keep doing it. And in a nutshell, the returns have collapsed. I mean, the money is being wasted. The apartment buildings are sitting empty, and people who bought the apartment buildings, whether they're living in them or not, have just watched the value of those, fall by half. And then you've got this. You actually have this long simmering financial crisis. So it's not quite that the order has been reversed, but I'd say COVID, it was already starting to happen, and then COVID inserted itself. So by the way, probably a little too much detail, but the economy goes from 10, 12% growth down, protect the 6, protect the 8%, 6%, 4%. Now they're kind of hanging on by their fingernails We're not even really sure it's 4%. Probably some people think closer to zero. So you've got this financial crisis. Then you have COVID, where you have like drones flying up to looking in your apartment window, deciding, well, maybe you were infected. And they literally will have people in hazmat suits come in and drag you out and throw you in prison, really. And you're in there for weeks, months. And then all of a sudden, a few people get angry, hold up some blank pieces of paper, and the government says, okay, we were just kidding. Everybody go. We've got no more COVID protection. So you go from, complete, really totalitarian, like incarcerating the whole country, to, oh, well, forget about it. It didn't happen. A couple million people are going to die, whatever. And by the way, just to get back to the origins theory, I don't know where COVID started, but I do know that the Chinese authorities are concerned that it started with this lab, and it was a lab leak. But I don't know that they know, but just their behavior. You have to read a lot of what they say and do kind of through in a mirror, so you can look at it backwards. And they're really concerned. I think they've got a lot to answer to the world for how they handle COVID and let it get out of control because of their crazy system that does not prize free flow of information.
Yeah. So Matt Ridley, a friend who was supposed to be on yesterday, and he's sick, not from COVID, but he was sick, and so he canceled, or postponed. But he was sort of heroic about the lab leak stuff, and it is really interesting to me how he makes this point. I've seen him make it elsewhere, that among Western populations, like among the general public, it's not that everyone is positive it was a lab leak, but it is considered to be a perfectly respectable theory and highly plausible, in fact, theory. And in fact, I'm fairly convinced. I don't think it was intentionally leaked, but it was obviously. I think it's pretty obvious it was probably some sort of lab leak. But he makes the point that it is still extremely controversial among elite public health officials, universities, the sort of public health, global World Health Organization sort of networks. And this is not me putting words in his mouth. I'll just make it my own opinion. But it feels in part, this is because of a certain amount of wordplay intended kowtowing to China on this, is that the tentacles of China into the sort of global transnational institutions like WHO and whatnot, and the funding streams into a lot of universities, make it just very difficult to talk about this honestly. And we saw this really strongly in the initial days of COVID, where people were saying it was racist to say it came from a wet market, and then they were saying, no, it's racist to say it came from a lab leak. And it's like, first of all, pick a lane, and second of all, stop calling it racist. We're trying to figure out where this disease that cost the world tens of trillions of dollars, as far as I can tell, and killed millions upon millions of people came from. It's a perfectly legitimate thing to try and figure out. But anyway, I you can feel free to respond to any of that. But to bring it back to this sort of long tail of the sort of the way COVID broke the social contract, and the fear of the Chinese Communist Party of its people, where would we see cracks? Like, would it be post G, like a succession kind of battle?
Yeah, it's interesting because the kind of elite intelligentsia overseas, but with contacts into China. They're always predicting the demise of Xi, one way or another. It's, 1 week it's bad health, 1 week it's some kind of coup from the military. So, I think, I first of all, I can't predict it, but I can say he's aging. I think he could have another 10 years to go, maybe 20 years of actual power. But, it's very unstable power. And every time, even when you come up to these every 5-year kind of re-elections, and obviously he's blown through all the guardrails on that, it's a tense time. Obviously, any succession is the most problematic time for a totalitarian regime. Just watch or rewatch The Death of Stalin, great movie.
It's a fantastic movie, yeah.
I think that pretty much captures it. But I think that's the elite is always convinced change is going to be at the top. From what I saw from both the '89 Tiananmen protests, the many protests that have gone on since then, but especially these blank paper protests. My bet would be more that it's just something weird, spontaneous, that
Hmm.
just, somebody gets killed by, some official. We do see these things happen,
Yeah. Sort of
somebody
the
who
Arab
gets ripped.
Spring. If some peddler sets himself on fire and everyone just goes nuts, right?
Yeah, we've seen little. That's funny. I didn't make that connection, but we've seen things like that happen. I can't remember. I think it was Chongqing. There was something similar where, somebody hits. They're in a BMW or some luxury car. They hit somebody. They kill somebody's kid. It's a one-child policy. That kid is everything to them. The crowd goes around. The guy's like, "Hey, don't you know me? I'm Director General so and so." And they're like, we're going to get you, and we're going to, not going to stop. And so these things, again, I bet on something spontaneous from below.
Hmm.
But I will bet on, you asked if there's going to be a straight line thing for 20 years. I definitely would bet against that. I don't know where the cracks are going to be. I do know that, there are fissures. I mean, look, it's a country of 1.4 going to 1.4 billion people going to 700 million by the end of the century or so.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of cracks. There are a lot of stresses. I mean, it's amazing. You have to give the CCP credit for holding the place together and presiding over the economic development it did. And it's like, okay, your sell-by date is fast approaching. I don't know what's coming next. Let's hope we can have a more normal China. Again, do you want the world's second biggest economy that when there's a pandemic that comes out, their first instinct is to cover it up. Second instinct is to lie. The third instinct is to lash out at anybody who wants the truth. Remember that the Australian Prime Minister who said, why don't we have an investigation into this? For that, Australia was put in the penalty box for years with
Hmm.
key exports cut off to China for doing what China said that it wanted, right? And so it brings into your question about the World Health Organizations and totally compromised. And the doctors that they brought in were on a completely sanitized tour. They were clearly afraid to talk. Meanwhile, our friends in Taiwan don't even have observer status at the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
There is something wrong with the world order when those two things can be true at the same time.
Yeah. So, like in my partisan free market hat, wearing my partisan free market hat or partisan for free markets, the thing that drove me crazy about a lot of the coverage of China over the last, really in the late '90s, early 2000s, the Tom Friedman China for a day kind of stuff, was you have these people, these sort of technocratic progressives who looked at China, which, you know, as I used to rant about this, China tried everything short of embracing markets, to the point where it killed, you pick your number, 30 million, 60 million people, with collectivization and the Cultural Revolution and all that. And then Deng Xiaoping is like, damn it, all right, let's try markets. Dirty markets, corrupted markets, like poorly supervised markets, but markets nonetheless. And for the first time in history, hundreds of millions of Chinese can eat meat, can read, have indoor plumbing, and all this kind of stuff. And because of it's authoritarian capitalism, so many of the Westerners look at it and go, wow, it must have been the authoritarianism. And when in fact it's so obvious what it was, right? And this is, I mean, just, I feel bad because I'm so interested in all this other stuff, and I do want to get to do the Jimmy Lai, so we can circle back to that. Is like, that's sort of the Jimmy Lai point, is that markets are what work. Markets are what make people richer. Markets are what make more people able to pursue happiness. And Jimmy Lai was like the poster child for that.
Yeah.
And he ended up later in life. It's a great book. It's a great story. And he ended up being a Hayek guy, and I'm a Hayek guy. I hate to ask this in such a dour, sad way, but like, other than the work that you're doing and people like you and, friends like Bill McGurn and other people who are trying to fly this flag, other than just international pressure, what possible reason would China have to let Jimmy Lai go?
Yeah. Well, I think he's more, I think the point we and many others are making is he's much more trouble in prison than out of prison. I mean, the Apple Daily Press has, been sold off. You know, staff has been disbanded, the ones that aren't in jail. Um, he that has no ambitions. He's an elderly man. He has no ambitions to be a Mandela or a Fuenza or lead any kind of a movement. And it's just an irritant. I remember
Hmm.
Ali Alatas, the Indonesian foreign minister in the 80s, maybe early 90s, said when he was asked about East Timor and its aspirations for independence, he just dismissed it. He just says, "Yeah, it's like a pebble in our shoe." Well, eventually the Indonesians took off the shoe and freed
Yeah.
the pebble, and yeah, we're a pebble in the shoe, but I mean, at some point, China's got enough problems, moving along, and that it doesn't need any more pebbles in its shoes. So yeah, I mean, it's got to. I think they have to see it's in their interest. My job as an activist is to, I think the book is actually pretty, if not, it's as scholarly as it can be given the limitations. I mean, I had a lot of letters and other things. I tried to have a balanced book. The guy is not a saint. He's not a perfect person, but
He
he's
was kind of
very
the
heroic.
Rupert Murdoch of Hong Kong in some respects, right? He was sort of a tabloid newspaper guy. He was like, he had fun. I'm not saying he was like Thomas Jefferson, but he was on the side of the
He
good
had fun.
guys.
I think the difference between him and Murdoch is he would never kowtow to the Chinese. I think he would just
Fair.
but uh so yeah, so that's I guess there's a lot of pressure, and again, I happen to know Jimmy. I think the guy is amazing, but I wouldn't want to forget my other Apple Daily colleagues in jail. I wouldn't want to forget the hundreds of other Hong Kongers. I wouldn't want to forget the, how countless number of Chinese in jail. And, by the way, I want to correct, you made a very interesting point. I said I give the CCP credit for economic growth. Yeah, it was after they killed 45 million people or
Right.
so in the famine, and how many other millions, through various struggle sessions. So, they killed so many of their people. They wasted so much time. And you're right. It was markets. It wasn't the CCP that did
Right.
this. It was letting the Chinese people free to be free.
It was letting them have the guts to give up on part of their ideology, not their ideology, right? Allowing a little freedom created a lot of wealth, and they're just not willing to let enough freedom in that would affect
But I mean, it's
their
crazy.
jobs.
So, coming back to you're right about Jimmy. I mean, he's so emblematic of this story. You think of this guy, he born, see, we're not exactly sure when he was born, but let's say 2 years before Mao took power, into a fairly wealthy family. It's splintered. Family, the revolution splinters the family. They lose their house. People move in. Jimmy's doesn't even graduate from primary school. If he can find a grilled mouse in the field, if he can find a mouse that he can grill, running around, he's like happy. That's some protein for the day. Makes his way to Hong Kong. I mean, his whole story is one that's a quest for freedom. And if you think of it as a kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I mean, first it's just the freedom to eat. He
Right.
wakes up in Hong Kong that first morning. He says, "Food is freedom." I could smell rice, the congee, the porridge, the dough, the buns, and that was freedom. And then it was the freedom to work and make his own way in life, and the freedom to buy a Rolls Royce, have a pet bear in the backyard in his little mini zoo. Freedom to start his own business. It was classic, and keep moving up, and then it's the freedom of democracy, freedom of love, and eventually the freedom that he found through his conversion to Catholicism. And so it's just an incredible story, and it exemplifies, I think, the push for freedom, certainly among Hong Kong people, but I would say among really a lot of people in China. And again, I think we're going to look back and say, especially apologists for China, say, like, how did we get this so wrong? How
Mhm.
could we not have realized that Chinese people are not happy in this system? How could we have just let Xi Jinping and the CCP get away with telling us all these lies, even at places like the UN and international forums? How can we let them get away with thinking they can just grab another country just because they think they've got some spurious historic claim to it? And we've got the South China Sea. I mean, the whole thing is built on lies.
All right, Mark Clifford, thank you so much for doing this. I hope you come back. Um,
I'd love to.
this was a lot of fun. I mean, it's a little depressing, but I think it's important, and it was very interesting for me, so I really appreciate it.
Don't be depressed. I mean, you see, you mentioned, you used the word dour before. Now you're saying depressed. I mean, look, there are people out there fighting, and I think Jimmy, we had an incredible conversation. It was a live stream with Nathan Sharansky, who spent 9 years in the Soviet Gulag.
Right.
And Jimmy, I didn't quite realize this. It was too unreal for me, but Jimmy knew he was about to go to prison. And he basically talked with Sharansky about how to live as a free man in prison. And Sharansky said, look, I couldn't decide when I was physically going to be free. That was up to my captors, up to the KGB, but I could live as a free man. And from everything I've seen of Jimmy, and from what I still hear, from letters that I've seen, he is living as a free man. He's freer than he's ever been. Of course, he wants to get out. He's in a tiny solitary cell, windowless. He doesn't control his physical life, but he is spiritually and mentally as free as he's ever been. I mean, it's time. He's a British citizen. It's time to let him go home, go back, join his family in Britain, and live his last years as a free man. But it's not dour. It's really hopeful that we have people like Jimmy and others, continue to fight, continue to, I think, show what's best in the human spirit. And I've been blessed, privileged to just work with some extraordinary people over these last 5 years.
All right, that's a much better final word. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jonah.